something alarming is happening in the American Southwest. In the middle of one of the driest landscapes on Earth, a massive reservoir that millions depend on is suddenly losing water again. Just a few years ago, its dramatic decline triggered fears of an unprecedented water crisis. Then conditions improved, water levels rose, and the danger appeared to be fading. But in 2026, that recovery has abruptly reversed. Lake Mead is falling once again, and this time, the reason extends hundreds of miles upstream to Lake Powell, where another crisis is unfolding. What is happening between these two reservoirs could have consequences across the entire Southwest. Lake Mead exists because the Colorado River could not be trusted. Before the 20th century, the river was both a lifeline and a threat, flooding unpredictably in wet years and shrinking dramatically during droughts. As cities and agriculture expanded across the arid American West, controlling and storing its water became increasingly important. The solution was one of America's most ambitious engineering projects, Hoover Dam. Constructed between 1931 and 1936 during the Great Depression, Hoover Dam transformed the Colorado River. Rising over 700 feet above the canyon floor, it blocked the river and created Lake Mead behind it, a vast reservoir stretching between Nevada and Arizona. When full, Lake Mead extends more than 100 miles into the desert and can store roughly 26 million acre-feet of water, making it the largest reservoir in the United States by capacity. But Lake Mead is far more than a massive lake. It is a critical piece of infrastructure. It stores and regulates water that supports cities, industries, and agricultural regions across the Southwest. It feeds Hoover Dam's turbines, generating hydroelectric power that has fueled development for generations. And it acts as a buffer, holding water during wet years so it can be released during drought. The wider Colorado River system supports around 40 million people, irrigates millions of acres of farmland, and extends beyond U.S. borders into Mexico. Although not all of this water comes directly from Lake Mead, the reservoir remains a critical part of the system, helping transform an unpredictable river into a reliable water supply for the Southwest. Before we continue, don't forget to click on that subscribe button and like this video, as it's the best way to support this channel. To understand Lake Mead, you have to look far beyond it. The water that fills this desert reservoir does not originate in Nevada or Arizona. It begins hundreds of miles away, high in the Rocky Mountains. Each winter, snow accumulates across the upper Colorado River basin, particularly in Colorado and Wyoming. This snowpack acts as a natural storage system, locking water in place until temperatures rise in spring. As the snow melts, it feeds streams and tributaries that combine to form the Colorado River. That seasonal pulse of runoff is the lifeblood of the entire system. Before that water ever reaches Lake Mead, it flows into another enormous reservoir, Lake Powell. Created by Glen Canyon Dam. In the 1960s, Lake Powell sits upstream and serves as the first major storage point for Colorado River water. From there, water is released through Glen Canyon Dam, travels through the Grand Canyon, and eventually flows into Lake Mead, where it is stored again before continuing downstream. This creates a simple but powerful chain. For decades, Lake Powell and Lake Mead work together, storing water during wet years and releasing it during droughts. The idea was that one could support the other when conditions became difficult. But when too little water enters the system to replenish both, that relationship changes. Instead of supporting each other, the two reservoirs begin competing for the same limited supply. At the start of the 21st century, Lake Mead was almost full. But beginning around 2000, something changed. The Colorado River Basin entered a prolonged period of dryness, one that would later be described not just as a drought, but as a long-term shift toward a more arid climate. Temperatures rose. Snowpack became less reliable. More water evaporated from soils and reservoirs. And as demand continued to grow, the river was asked to provide more water than it could consistently deliver. Over the next 2 decades, Lake Mead steadily declined. The shoreline retreated. A stark white bathtub ring appeared along the canyon walls, marking where the water once stood. Landscapes that had been submerged for decades reemerged. By 2022, the crisis reached a critical point. Lake Mead fell to around 1,040 feet above sea level, its lowest level since the reservoir was originally filled in the 1930s, bringing dangerously low thresholds that once seemed distant much closer to reality. Then, unexpectedly, conditions improved. The winter of 2022 to 23 brought strong snowpack to parts of the Colorado River basin, increasing runoff. Lake Mead responded by rising significantly from its record low. For a moment, the system seemed to be stabilizing, but that stability was temporary. In early 2026, Lake Mead was still holding on to some of its recovery, but within months, the decline returned, and quickly. By late July, the reservoir had fallen to roughly 1,041 feet above sea level, bringing it back near the dangerously low levels that had triggered widespread alarm just a few years earlier. The speed of the decline raised a critical question: what changed? The answer begins in the mountains. The winter of 2025 to 26 delivered one of the weakest snow seasons on record across the upper Colorado River basin. Snowpack was exceptionally poor, and unusually warm conditions accelerated melting while reducing the amount of water that ultimately reached the river. By early summer, inflows into Lake Powell, upstream of Lake Mead, had collapsed. In June alone, inflow was just a fraction of normal levels. That created another problem. Lake Powell itself began approaching dangerously low elevations, threatening hydroelectric generation at Glen Canyon Dam, and, eventually, its ability to efficiently release water downstream. Faced with this risk, water managers were forced to act. Releases from Lake Powell toward Lake Mead were significantly reduced. Roughly 1.5 million acre-feet that would have flowed downstream, about 20% of the total water originally scheduled for release during the 2026 water year, is now being retained to protect Lake Powell. That decision changes everything. Lake Mead depends on those releases. With less water arriving while Mead continues supplying downstream users, more water is leaving the reservoir than entering it. This is what makes 2026 different. Lake Mead is not just declining because of drought. It is declining because the system no longer has enough water to maintain both reservoirs at safe levels. Protecting Lake Powell now comes at a cost, and that cost is being paid by Lake Mead. Lake Mead does not need to run dry for serious problems to emerge. The risks begin long before the reservoir reaches empty. As water levels fall, Hoover Dam's ability to generate electricity declines. Lower water means less pressure and, therefore, less power generation. Around 950 feet above sea level, Lake Mead approaches what is known as minimum power pool, where normal hydropower generation becomes extremely difficult. Below that lies an even more critical threshold, dead pool, at around 895 feet. At that level, water could no longer flow downstream through Hoover Dam in the usual way. Lake Mead is not close to those levels today, but the margin separating it from them is shrinking, and the consequences extend far beyond Hoover Dam. Continued declines could bring deeper water cuts across Arizona, Nevada, and California. Agricultural regions, which consume much of the Colorado River's water, could face further reductions, affecting food production and local economies. Mexico would also be affected. Las Vegas is better protected than many assume. The city has invested heavily in deep water intake and pumping infrastructure that can continue drawing water even if Lake Mead falls significantly further. But infrastructure cannot create water that does not exist. Efforts to stabilize the system are already underway. Water use across the lower basin has been reduced through conservation agreements. Farmers are being compensated to use less water, And cities are improving efficiency, recycling water, and investing in new infrastructure. Water managers are also changing how reservoirs operate. Additional water is being released from upstream reservoirs, like Flaming Gorge, to support Lake Powell, while release schedules are being adjusted to prevent dangerously low levels. But these are short-term responses to a long-term problem. The rules governing how Colorado River water is divided are being rewritten, with a new operating framework expected to take effect in 2027. The reality is becoming increasingly clear. The river cannot reliably provide as much water as the region has grown accustomed to using. Nature could still provide relief. Several strong snow years in the Rocky Mountains could significantly raise Lake Powell and Lake Mead. But one wet winter cannot erase decades of imbalance. These reservoirs were built to protect the Southwest from drought, storing water during good years and releasing it during bad ones. Today, however, both are depleted simultaneously, leaving far less flexibility. In 2026, water managers are increasingly deciding where to preserve the limited water that remains. The question is whether the Southwest can adapt before that buffer disappears even further.